quite frankly, I don't think I'm a particularly tolerable person if I don't have painting in my life. And I certainly don't enjoy this life anywhere near as much when I'm not painting. So it's very difficult for me to give a rational, reasonable answer to why painting, but it's part of who I am. Certainly growing up, I was always very suspicious. Having studied in a school in Kenya as a child, we didn't do Kenyan history, we did English history. And that's because I was in an international school, but nonetheless, like I remember being sort of like 10 or 11 and talking to my mother's family and to my dad about different things in Kenyan history, and I remember thinking like, this is bizarre that I know about 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and know nothing at all of our history at home. And I suppose in that sense, it was also something that made me realize that there are stories from home, from Kenya and Nairobi, that aren't told within the contemporary cultural context and are overlooked in favor, and had been overlooked in favor of other things that were seen to have some sort of cultural importance and significance. And then when it came to the point in my sort of life as an artist where I wanted to tell stories, it felt like all of these things could be useful for exploring a narrative. I was very lucky then when I was maybe 8 or 9. My closest friend at the time was called Rick van Rampelberg, and through his mother, Chilenge, I was introduced to the life of an artist, as she is, I think, often talked of as the first female sculptor from Kenya. So I got that kind of eye into what it is to live in a world where the imagination is important, and where the consistency of a story isn't what matters. The journey of the story is perhaps what's more interesting. So all the paintings are made on labuga bark, which literally translates as a funeral bark cloth. I was initially looking for a surface that would both locate my work from the very beginning within an East African cultural context, partly so I didn't have to think about and deal with, you know, if I made a gesture that looked like an expressionist gesture, I would then have to deal with German expressionist painting, you know, and suddenly my work would sit in that context. I didn't want to have to do that every time I made a painting and wanted to pull from a language and have to sacrifice the history in which the subjects I wanted to approach were sitting within. So I was looking for something that would very much locate the work within that narrative. And that specific historical context. And then not only that, I wanted something that would also be resistant to the act of painting in some way. So I had tried quite a lot of different materials, whether it was woven palm leaf mats or patterned cloths. But it was only when I found this cloth and stretched it and primed it, and it began to function more like a canvas. And the things it was doing was really quite subtle, that I felt like, you know, something was beginning to happen that was interesting and that I could use. And that's because with other materials, like with the woven palm leaf mats, it always looked like paint on a woven palm leaf mat, you know, like there wasn't ever any slippage. The object became fetishized, saying that I'm something different, you know, this is it. But I wanted that slippage to be much more subtle and to be in the work from the beginning. And then, you know, once I found the material and found that it had this incredible cultural significance for the Buganda, the people that make it, but all of that was removed when it was shown in a tourist context, which is where I found it. That also was interesting to me because it seemed to mimic a lot of the cultural pressures that development brings, and a lot of the kind of shifts and loss of meaning and purpose in, you know, some of the cultural aspects of culture and tradition and ritual that happens when you perform it for somebody else in a tourist context, but also secondly, just through the change in development, you know, different rituals and things lose their purpose. And for somehow, like the narrative of this cloth seemed to be parallel to a lot of those stories and ways that I had felt that cultures were changing at home. So they really became integral, not only to something conceptual and relatively removed from the object itself, but also to anything that would go on it. So there's very much a kind of synergy between the surface and the image, you know, and the process. And like that, there are points at which holes then become important to the figures that they're on. And sometimes the stitching can be used in a compositional sense to interrupt a read. And other times the stitching is there just because that's, you know, that's where it was in the cloth. So like that, the formal aspects of the cloth have also become integral to the formal aspects of the paintings. For example, if I was to talk about the Promised Land as a painting, there were kind of several considerations that I started with. One was from a narrative point of view, that I wanted to make a painting thinking about what it was to support a political movement and ways that one can use themselves to support a movement. And I'd been to this rally, and at the end of the rally I was also sent a lot of photos and had researched a lot of photos about and from the kind of period leading up to the 2017 elections in Kenya. Again, one of the things I was struck by was that there were some figures that were at all of the rallies, you know, and not only were they at the rallies, but there were points at which rallies had turned violent, and they were also the ones who were running through the tear gas, picking up the canisters, throwing them back at the police, and throwing stones at the police, and then subsequently also being shot at. And those guys were usually paid figures to bring the energy and the support. So when I was thinking about doing a painting kind of approaching this idea of support, I wanted these different stages and kind of elements of support, and for it to almost form a kind of a progression. So in the top left, I'd kind of imagined this huge crowd, this scene of protesters or supporters, you know, carrying banners and so on, and then they would progress towards you. And so then in the bottom left, there's a group of figures. One of the things that I was struck by at the rally was the way that, you know, kind of seductive, very familiar ideologies were used to lift the temperature, to make people more fervent, to increase, you know, the kind of emotional support as well. And I wanted something that would function like a seductive ideology within the painting. And so then I started thinking, well, in the history of painting, what are the seductive ideologies? And the way that a female nude had functioned throughout a lot of the history of painting felt like it was almost like a seductive ideology. You know, that it was something that could be repeated time and time again and functioned in a very similar way. And so I decided to have the poster, instead of being one of the things that was written, to have it as that was what they were kind of using as their banner. This was a sort of female nude, a reclining nude. And so these figures were then progressing, and the next stage of their progression was the point at which the authorities and them had a clash. There are paintings like The Execution of Maximilian, which for me has been a cornerstone painting in my thinking as an artist. Not only Manet's work, but that particular painting. And then one of the other aspects I was thinking about is how the smoke is used in that painting. And smoke almost becomes this transformative element, where in the case of the execution of Maximilian, you know, that's the point at which life is lost and you know, the figure becomes something else, where the smoke is the indicator. And so for me, I had wanted to bring that into my own painting, The Promised Land, where there's tear gas and the figures in the painting who perhaps were taking on the authorities or charging through the tear gas and throwing stones. The tear gas again played that part where they would then change state in the smoke. And so I wanted that, again, for the figures to be kind of hurling stones into, you know, through the smoke, or the tear gas in this case. And so there are a couple tear gas canisters. But then the threat of death, which was real, because often those guys were fired on with live bullets, to be there, and for the smoke from the tear gas to show that. Part of the events that unfolded after the 2017 election that was annulled and then carried out again was that there was a girl who was sat in a balcony who was hit and shot by a stray bullet at one of the rallies that had turned violent, and she died. And so I wanted her presence to be there as well. So there's a girl sitting on top of a balcony in the painting. But one of the other aspects I wanted to use was something in the painting that pointed towards a subtext or a truth or something like this, you know. And so there's a baboon figure who sits on top of a book and points down to the title of the book, which is The Paradise Edict. So it was kind of building up from, you know, all these different places. And then the scale of the painting, it was important that it had a relationship to history painting. So at that stage, it's the largest painting that I had ever sort of undertaken to make. The image was very translatable across cultures as well, which was something that was interesting, because often with political moments, they feel specific to a time. They feel specific to you and your situation, and like this is it, you know. But then the form of expression, the language, it's often something that's translated again, not only across cultures but across times. You can find almost the same rhetoric being used to the same effect. And so that's kind of where I was. That's the kind of land that I was kind of occupying in my mind when approaching the painting The Promised Land. When I was setting out the cornerstones of what I was interested in, trying to kind of really find a framework on which I could build, I wanted to make a work that would be relatable if somebody from Nairobi or from Kenya went into an exhibition in Nairobi in Kenya, that they would find something that they could relate to immediately on the walls. Certainly one of the things that I was and have always been drawn to in other artists is that there are no such things as obligations. I feel like each individual one of us provides our own set of things that we feel is a better way of living in this world, a better way of trying to understand our own surroundings and who we are within that. Part of what I've always loved from the process of making is engaging in the imagination and using one's imagination and forms of expression to explore that.